I'm really excited that we have so many great panelists joining us today, and I want to set the stage. Everyone in the chat, how many people we kind of Sarah talked about it have that play cousin, that auntie, and when I say auntie or uncle, it's your mama's best friend, in the chat, go ahead and drop all those different things. This is what this conversation is all about. Our chosen family, family that we know for us, you can tell us is not blood. But what I think is amazing for this conversation, we have data rooted from the Pew Research Center that is adding context to something that is near and dear to so many of us on this call. So we are going to jump right into this, and I'm so excited to bring in first the Pew Research Center, Kiana Cox. She is a senior researcher with the institution. It is one of those, I tell people I'm based in DC, and the Pew Research Center is respected by everyone. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you fall on. So to me, that is something that this institution has continued to bring us facts, information, and data. So I'm going to start it with you to set the stage for us on some of this research and what you all discovered diving into this notion of play cousins and chosen family and how that leads to mutual aid in our communities.
All right, thank you, Kirstin. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that our participants and guests can see some of the data that I want to share. Okay. All right. So everybody can see the screen? We're okay? Thank you. All right. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here to share some results from a report that we published this past February on connection and care in Black families. First, I want to begin with just a little bit about the Pew Research Center. Um, our parent company and primary funder is the Pew Charitable Trust, and we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy research organization. This means that we don't interpret our data for you. We don't take policy positions or make policy recommendations, but our goal is to use data-driven social science in order to inform the public about the issues and attitudes that shape our world. And that brings us to our discussion today. So in this study, we look at how Black people describe their family networks and the support that those networks provide. Specifically, we'll look at Black families on three levels of connection and care. We'll look at the birth family, we'll look at non-relative family members, and then we'll also look at intraracial connections. In terms of connection, we're going to pay attention to how close Black people say they are to their families. And in terms of care, we're going to take a look at both the emotional and financial support that Black people get from their family networks. So we'll start with the birth family. We asked Black adults how close would they feel to several different family members. So if you take a look at the top panel of the slide in the box, we'll see that although spouses and partners and non-relative family members are at the top of the list, Black people are still very close to their birth families. About 2/3 of Black adults say they are extremely or very close to their parents and siblings. Fewer say they're close to their grandparents and other extended family members like cousins or aunts and uncles. But what's clear is that Black people overall are fairly close to their families, to their birth families, that is. If you look at the bottom panel of the slide, we asked a similar question in terms of not only closeness, but how likely is it that you would turn to any of these family or each of these family members for emotional support? And we see that about half of Black adults say they would turn to a parent or sibling for emotional support. Fewer say they would turn to extended family like grandparents or cousins, but overall, we see that both in terms of closeness and emotional support, families, both the nuclear family and the extended family, are important sources of that support for Black people. In fact, if we take a look again at extended families, that's where Black Americans stand out from other Americans in terms of their family networks. If you take a look at the gray shaded bar on the right hand side, we'll see the difference in the shares between Black adults and other Americans. And in that other category, we have white, Hispanic, and Asian adults. But Black Americans stand out on all of these measures compared to those other groups. So you see that when we asked, how close are you to your cousins? Black people are more likely than other Americans by a 22-point difference to say that they're close to their cousins. A similar share say that they are close to a similar difference between Black people and other Americans is found in closeness to aunts and uncles. And then about a 14-point difference in between Black adults and other Americans in terms of how close they are to their grandparents. There's a similar pattern when we look at leaning on the extended family for emotional support. Black Americans are more likely than other Americans to lean on grandparents, cousins, and aunts and uncles for emotional support. So, what this suggests is that emotional support and closeness aren't just part of the nuclear family, they're part of the extended family. And for Black people, the extended family is especially important in terms of those emotional support networks. So now let's go one step further in terms of connection and care. And we'll look at these non-relative family members. So some social scientists call these fictive kin, but as we mentioned at the top of the webinar, a lot of us like to call these our play cousins. So how many Black people in the United States have a play cousin? 77%. In fact, almost 60% told us that they have more than one. And so, although many Americans have these non relative family members, so these are people who are not related to them by birth, marriage, or law, we see that about 60% of other Americans have these people in their lives as well. But Black people are more likely to have them overall and more likely to have multiple non relative family members or multiple play cousins. So, what this data demonstrates to us is that Black family networks are not limited to nuclear families or even extended families. They're also a part of a larger family network that includes people who are not related to Black Americans by birth, marriage, or law. And so we also asked, when it comes to these non-relative family members or play cousins, how do Black people know them? How did we come to know these people? And so first, notice that for most Americans, non-relative family members are based on longevity, friendship, or support. They are people who we've known for a long time. They are people who we consider to be close friends or who supported us through difficulty. But if you take a look at the box at the bottom of the slide, when it comes to Black Americans, they stand out because their non relative family members are more likely to be people who share culture and community with them. So, for example, about 85% of Black people say that their fictive kin or play cousins are people who share an identity with them. About 75% say that these are people who share religious or spiritual beliefs with them, and a little more than half say that these are people who grew up in neighborhoods with them. So for Black people, culture and community are also a really important part in defining who is family. So now let's take a look at closeness to non-relative family members or fictive kin or play cousins. One of the things that really stands out in our data is that non-relative family members are extremely close to Black people. And so you'll notice here, if you look at the box in the center, that non-relative family members are just as likely to be close to Black people as their spouse or partner, but in many cases, they're more close to them than their birth families. So non-relative family members have a deep connection with Black Americans in the United States. And if we look at emotional support, we see a similar pattern where non-relative family members are just as likely to be sources of emotional support as parents and siblings. A little more likely to be a source of emotional support than the extended family, but still, they rank really high, both in terms of emotional closeness and support in the family network. So this suggests to us that Black people's emotional support networks not only include the nuclear family or the extended family, but also includes these fictive kin ties or these non-relative family members. Now let's go one step further when in terms of connection and care. And we'll talk about intraracial connections. That is, how connected do Black people feel to other Black people in the United States? So, about 60% of Black Americans say they see other Black people in the US as their brothers or sisters. There's not a lot of differences among Black people on this question, but there are some differences if you look at the box in the bottom when it comes to Black identity. So, Black people who say that being Black is an important part of how they think of themselves, they are more likely than Black people who don't say that about their Black identity. They're more likely to say that they see other Black people as their brothers and sisters. So, this idea of connection, of thinking of all Black people in the United States as brothers and sisters, that feeling, that idea is related to Black identity. We see a similar pattern when we look at ideas of collective responsibility. So about 80% of Black Americans say that they feel at least somewhat of a responsibility to look out for other Black people in the United States. If you look at the box at the bottom, we also see that there's a difference there by experience in terms of how important Black identity is to you. So Black people who say that being Black is important to them are much more likely to say that they feel a responsibility to look out for other Black people in the United States. They're more likely to say that than Black adults who say that Black identity is less important to them. So ideas of connection and care for Black Americans go through the birth family, into the extended family, into our non-relative family members, and then it also extends outward into the broader Black community in the United States in terms of feeling like other Black people are their brothers and sisters and feeling a responsibility to look out for them. Now we'll take a look at one last aspect of connection and care for Black Americans, and that's financial support. About 60% of Black Americans have given money to family members in the year prior to the survey. And the Black people who are most likely to have given this financial assistance are young adults, so those who are younger than 50, college graduates, Black people who are in a middle or upper income range, and we're cutting that off at about $50,000. So people who have family incomes above $50,000, those who are married or cohabitating, and also immigrants. So these are the people who are most likely to have said that they have given money to their parents or family members in the prior year. But now let's look at this in just a little bit of a broader view. First, we see that Black people are more likely than other Americans to give financial assistance to their families. There's about a 60-40 split there, where Black adults are more, about 60% of Black adults say they've given money or financial assistance to their families, compared to about 40% of Americans of other races and ethnicities. But we also see a difference in the effect of giving this financial support, such that Black adults who have given this financial support, about half of them say that providing this assistance hurt their finances, compared to about 35% of other Americans. So we see that connection and care in Black families includes closeness, it includes emotional support, and it also includes financial support, even if that financial support comes at a personal cost. And so I'll end my part of this discussion right there. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to listen to me. And if you would like to read the full report, you can find it by visiting pewresearch.org/topic/race-ethnicity.
Thanks so much, Kiana. We actually also put the link into the chat so everyone has access to it to follow along while you were talking. So thank you so much for kind of setting the stage for us with data. And now I want people to keep your questions, start thinking about them. I want to bring in our other panelists, and I'm very excited to bring in more members of our URL Media Network, our URL Media cousins, since we're talking about that. And for those who don't know or are new to our world, URL Media is a network of multicultural, independent publishers serving Black and Brown immigrant newsrooms across the country. We are now a network of 50. Y'all are getting some new news here, 50 outlets across the country, and we have two of them here. Very excited to welcome T. Troutman is an Afro-pessimist, urban theorist, and communist organizer writing on and from the Black South. She is the managing editor for Scalawag magazine. She's also based in Houston, Texas. And let me tell you, Scalawag has so much going on looking at how race and politics, arts and culture, how Black culture intersects with all of that. So their work is really amazing. So excited to bring and welcome T to the conversation. But also we have Gary Lee. He is the managing editor and a key contributor to the Oklahoma Eagle. That's a Tulsa, Oklahoma-based media company that produces news and information. And they have been in the African American community for more than 100 years. So this is the kind of history that we have in the room, different perspectives. So T and Gary, thank you so much for jumping in, and we're excited to dive into this. And obviously, we just got the research, and I want to now turn from this research into lived experiences. From your perspective, how do you define kinship ties within your community? And T, I'll have you kick it off for us.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to be in the space. And I'm very happy that Scalawag is affiliated with your URL in that network. It's indispensable. I will start by saying I define kinship personally in a number of ways, or how I've come into kinship. So, as my bio alluded, for a number of years, for over a decade, I was a boots on the ground. My life was the movement community organizer in Atlanta. And that is of a anarcho-communist sort of orientation. So the roots of mutual aid are in anarchic and anarchist political thought. So I definitely have a lot of strong kinship ties in movement. I'm also an academic, so I have intellectual interlocutors who are my family at this point, especially the Afro-pessimist and Black studies community. And then, of course, just the everyday boots on the ground community, your neighbor sort of way. But I do think kinship has been indispensable for me, especially as a queer person and a queer organizer. I know I started to use the language of my kin in lieu of family to sort of associate with a chosen family, being in queer community in Atlanta. So um, I think of all walks of life, be it my blood family or the community around me, I've sort of found a way to root in a kinship structure.
And Gary, take us to a different part of the South. I think, again, when people think of Oklahoma, the South doesn't quite come to mind, but Tulsa in particular, I mean, that is the heart of Black culture when we think about what was being built in the early, 1920s before the Tulsa race riots. But Gary, kind of kick us off. What, in your perspective, how do you define kinship ties in your community? Oops, and let me unmute you. Hold on. Or can you unmute Gary? Yeah, we want to make sure we can hear everything you want to say. There
Thank
we
you
go.
for thank you for the question and thank you for inviting me. So I would say that there are some things about the Tulsa Black community which inspire the kinship in the community that are similar to other Black communities across the country. That would be, inspirations from churches, from sorority and fraternity organizations, from neighborhoods. But I would pinpoint three aspects of the Tulsa culture which give another layer or other inspiration to the kinship that we see across the community. One of them you alluded to was the Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. And so having that mutual experience in our history, I think, and having still one survivor of that massacre and many descendants from that has created a kind of an inspiration for a different members of the community to gather as family, even if they were not directly related to the massacre. I think it's inspired a kind of togetherness of shared history. The second thing that I would point out is I don't know how many on this call are familiar with Friedman culture, but Friedman culture is essentially the descendants of uh, people who were enslaved by Native American tribal leaders and brought to Oklahoma in around the 1830s. And so many descendants of that culture, including myself, are very active in the Tulsa Black community and create communities and brotherships, sisterships among themselves. And the third thing that I would mention is that, and I think you alluded to it as well, this idea of Black Wall Street, which comes from the era in which the Greenwood community, which is the center, was a center of entrepreneurship, really thrived, and that sentiment and the kind of entrepreneurial spirit still exists. And that also has given way to creating fraternal and sisterhood relationships that are related to helping each other build business in a way. So those are the three aspects of the kinship thriving, which are probably somewhat different in Tulsa.
And I love how both of you had different perspectives and outlooks on this. And I think that's what's also so unique about this topic is that this is a collective experience, yet it's also so unique and individual at the same time. Knowing that this is a topic and something that is so diverse and again so individual, how do each of you approach covering kinship ties and mutual aid in the Black community for your outlets? And Gary, I'll have you kind of pick that up, and then we'll go to T.
Sure. So just again, hearkening back to one of the aspects that I mentioned, and that is the race massacre of 1921, over a century ago. But we in the Oklahoma Eagle continue to uh, be the source of reminding people that what happened and that things have not been resolved that happened back in 1921. For example, in every issue of the Oklahoma Eagle, it's in our print editions, you will see in the left-hand corner the number of weeks that have passed since the race massacre and since nothing has been done about that. But we also have regular coverage about descendants, about, the story of mass graves of people who were killed in the race massacre whose graves have not been discovered. And one of those streams of articles centers around the survivors of the race massacre. There's one living, but one passed away in December. Her name was Viola Fletcher. She was known as Mother Fletcher in the community, and she was a mother figure for the whole community. And there are others who were related or maybe even not to the massacre who have that kind of distinction as being mothers in the community. So that's one way that we cover it. I'll just mention one other, and that is that we do have a beat at the Oklahoma Eagle on small business and entrepreneurship, which also is inspired by the fact that we have a history and we have a culture which is devoted to independent businesses. It's probably richer than in many other cities of our size across the country, and we've got a very good reporter who covers that regularly. So I could talk more, but I want to pass the mic to my colleague.
Thank you. And I just want to lead with saying Scalawag absolutely counts Oklahoma as the South. It's funny how people expect us to rein that in and draw borders, but we try to encompass all of the South. We even recognize a lot of our great migration folks and kin in a space that we call the South Deferred. So yes, we definitely count it as the South. But the way that we structure our movement coverage, because Scalawag is, first of all, we're movement media. So I think that's really important to sort of ground the how and why we cover mutual aid. So as I noted before, I identify as an anarcho-communist, as do my colleagues Deshaun Harrison and Sharonda J. Brown. We actually came from an anarcho-feminist publication, We're Your Voice, that no longer publishes, indie media dies every day, and that is an unfortunate casualty of that. But I think us being oriented in that sort of anarchist spirit at a movement publication, we are always looking at the ways in which the state abandons the people, especially in the face of crisis, whether that be like structural abandonment associated with Black folks, Indigenous folks, or it is sort of the regional structural abandonment that happens in the South. The South is historically, painted as a space or actively materially a space where the state, government favors small state and sort of big private organizations, big community. And so our coverage of mutual aid looks at the way that movements themselves foster mutual aid connections. So, during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, Scalawag's publishing really fostered on how folks were helping each other in a time where like information and accurate, adequate information was scarce, especially in the South where communication ties are fractured and severed in an intentional way. And one of our key pieces on it was from the Cop City movement. Um, so our frequent contributor, Julian Rose, wrote a piece about how mutual aid is essential for not just the Cop City movement, but left political movements in general. Because you can't often rely on the state or the nonprofit industrial complex or funders or philanthropists to put money in a fund just so that you can make sure your neighbors have masks and the people across the street, may have a food distro. I also come out of harm reduction. Scalawag has been a home for a Baltimore-based harm reduction column that was done by our late colleague Logan Hullinger, which is super important. Like I think harm reduction, if no other form of movement embodies a sort of mutual aid at the center ethos, it's that. And then I'll, wrap it up and say we are a multi-local publication at Scalawag. And so with us being a regional publication that seeks to do on-the-ground storytelling, we have a mutual aid relationship with movements, with organizers, with community members, to say that if you have a narrative that needs to come from the ground, that needs to come from the people doing the work, that needs to come from the people working collaboratively in a mutual aid structure, then we offer our space to, writers. And we try not to be a barrier to getting these narratives out. So I think we do that in a number of ways, like politically, communally, and sort of in our regional reporting structure.
And I love the phrasing of movement media because I think that is truly a distinction. And also, the work that's being done in our communities is a sense movement media because we are getting information to our communities, and that information may be about mutual aid. I'm glad you mentioned the pandemic because that is something I remember I was reporting in Memphis, Tennessee at the time. We saw that same groundswell of like, okay, how can we help our community as we're still figuring out this thing? And something like a through line that I thought was so interesting from Kiana's team at the Pew Research Center was the fact that, a lot of Black folks, we see other Black people as, we have this responsibility to look out for each other. It's not written down. There's no like, hey, you must do this. It's just like, hey, that's my brother, that's my sister. To me, when I see older members of the community, that's auntie and uncle. Like there's a sense of like we want to support, also respect. And when you look at the mutual aid, T, I love you already talked about how mutual aid in your coverage has almost been highlighting activism as mutual aid, organizing as mutual aid. I want you to dive into another story. I know where the church was a place of that mutual aid, and then Gary, I'll bring you in as well. But talk to us about how you covered that mutual. What did that look like? That kind of storytelling.
Yeah, so we received a pitch from the author Zhao, who had a story about how his community um, recovered from a very serious environmental crisis. So it's set in the context of the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis, which is a huge deal. I think when we think water crisis in the US, our mind automatically goes to Flint or Baltimore or other places. Obviously, the South is typically marginalized, even though we are the zone where infrastructural decline is as structural to our advancement and expansion and development as, government itself or as the people itself. I mean, it's a constitutive element of the way Southern communities are forced to develop in a space of non-thriving. And so I like the fact that this story told the sort of communal response from the community first or from the grassroots up. It gives a very, very good history of the sort of 1970s decline of the water pipe infrastructure, the way that the state response was always inadequate. And then, so given that the state response was so inadequate, community had to provide a sort of front line. So we always talk about frontline communities or communities who are most impacted by, in this case, climate change and infrastructure degradation. And the church itself, the Black church is like, it's one of the first things that comes to mind when we think about kinship and where you go for help, the sort of fraternal nature of Black institutions and Black communities, especially early Black communities, post emancipation Black communities. Churches are always the cornerstone. And so it's not just, churches feeding the community, but the church also being a hub of information and a space where people can go when they were directly impacted by the water crisis. And so a lot of our reporting, especially our climate, environmental, and disaster relief and recovery coverage, has a mutual aid ethos. We often ask that of our writers, hey, how is mutual aid functioning in this space? Because we know when disasters hit, I live in Houston, like when disasters hit, like community is most often there way before the state or the power company, maybe. So
Yeah. And Gary, I know when we were even talking before this discussion, I like how your almost your interpretation of mutual aid is the preservation of our history. You touched on it with the mutual experience of surviving and living through the Tulsa race massacre. But I know one story in particular is all about preserving our history and making sure Black history is still at the forefront in the community. So talk to me about that story, the Black History Saturdays.
Yep, I'll get to that in a second. Before I get to that, I just wanted to say a few words about whether we're the South or not the South. So in Oklahoma, there's an ongoing discussion about whether Oklahoma is the South, the West, or the intersection between them. My own view, my own experience is that we're very much part of the South, and I say that in part based on our history. I grew up in segregated Tulsa, where the schools that I went to were all Black by law, and and also I always consider places where there was legalized slavery part of the South, which there was in Oklahoma. Now, about Black History Saturdays, that segs into it. So, a very active advocate of history in our community, whose name is Christy Williams, created a couple of years ago a Black History kind of teach-in that's once a month. It takes place right in the center of the Black community. It's a full day on Saturday, and it's devoted to the teaching of history about Tulsa, about Oklahoma, nationally and internationally. So it's wildly popular. Christy's idea, and by the way, Christy and I are not blood related, but we very much call each other cousin. So we are part of that. But to do this, her spirit to do this was also out of the fact that the state legislature passed
Oh, is Gary freezing for y'all? I think we might have, his connection might be a little lost. We're going to, I'll have one member of our team reach out to Gary to see if we can get his connection together. But I know some of the Black History Saturdays when we were talking about it, he said the organizer initially was doing this for kids and, obviously making sure they knew about Black history. But he said it turned into adults and so many people wanting to participate in this. And now it's become, there's a push to try to make this national. So I love how this was, again, an example of mutual aid becoming mutual aid over, again, our history and something that we've seen in so many other states where there are book bans and even attempts to obviously roll back what is taught in the classroom. And, I have a couple more questions for our panelists, but those in the chat, let us know if you have any questions, even an experience you want to share, because as I mentioned, this is a shared experience. Oh, Gary, we have you back. Gary, I tried to pick it up for you. We lost your connection. I'll let you finish up. I know we lost you at, what was happening at the state level with legislation for that sparked Black History Saturdays.
Right. So what happened at the state level was that there was legislation that was passed which restricted the teaching of history in public schools, and it particularly, I think, was aimed at the teaching of Black history and Native history, and understanding that both of those are essential to everybody's understanding of Oklahoma. Kirstin.
We're getting there, y'all. Technology does not want us to be great, but it's okay. We're gonna when we can get the strong connection, we will bring Gary back in. But as I said, if you have questions, our URL media team is in the chat watching for those. But please share your experiences because this is a collective but individual experience with all of our cousins and aunties and all the things. But T, I want you to kind of take us forward. What does mutual aid look like in the future? Is there something distinct that you all are following with Scalawag? Let's break that down and kind of look forward. Oh, wait. Okay, Gary, we're going to try again and then I'll go to you, T. Thank you for everyone's flexibility.
Okay. Did you pick up where I talked about the inspiration from the state legislature about for Black History Saturdays?
We did. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I just wanted to say that these Saturdays have been wildly successful in creating circles of kinship surrounding information sharing and a shared history. So I'll leave it at that.
And we appreciate it. And we're glad the connection is strong. See, the connection, it goes beyond financial, emotional. It's also technology. So we got 20 more minutes, y'all. So we're hold on strong there. But Gary, I asked T to kick us off with looking forward. What does mutual aid look like? We're in a time when a lot of communities are under attack, Black, brown, immigrant. And so I want both of you to kind of tell us what does the future of mutual aid look like? And if there are any through lines your outlet is looking at, and we'll start with Scalawag.
Yeah, I think what Scalawag's through line is in thinking forward, sort of what I referenced earlier, that in the face of state abandonment, in the face of institutional decay, decline, abandonment, where are the people and where are the movements that serve them? And so, I mean, I could trace this all the way back, but we'll do recent history. I think in the immediate aftermath of COVID, and the internet boom and the way that tech is moving and the fascism of it all, I think grounds us and are looking forward. We are grossly aware of the precarious situation that media in general sits in. And by media, I mean the press and news, but also books, TV, film, our entire sort of media ecosystem, academia, public schools, curriculums. So in the South, we live under a number of censorship ordinances and legislations, censoring what colleges can teach, what public schools can teach, what books are banned, alongside, very real abortion bans, trans healthcare access bans. Um, that is a groundswell and a soup of happenings that forecast a future where, like, if we don't have each other, who will? And so on a press and media front, we work collaboratively and cooperatively with other left media publications, namely the Movement Media Alliance. There are folks in our networks and in our system that are looking at what does it look like for us to have a truly independent press, a press free from what big philanthropy, what the state, what somebody else in charge or who has direct access to power and to will that power might dictate be reported or the way that they dictate narrative. And so at a time where our people, our community, our audience are facing rising media illiteracy, general illiteracy, right? The turn toward AI, toward technology, toward the phone, the pandemic's impact on public schools, the state's efforts to defund schools all the way up to the college level. It's like our people need help literally learning how to read. And by like learning how to read, I mean like discern propaganda, discern media, or discern bias in media, to really get to the root of the truth. And so I think working in a way that builds out a robust, truly independent media ecosystem that works in lockstep with the movements that are serving community right now is the best defense that we have of a future that looks like further decline, whether it be climate or political or whatever the case may be. If this is where we're moving, if what we're experiencing now is any indicator of where the future will be, then we need to be on the front line of organizing mutual aid around, as Gary alluded to, like information sharing, information gathering, and not just training the next generation of media reporters and movement workers, but being a resource for community in a way that's not beholden to structures that misalign with us on a number of fronts.
Yeah. And in a sense, empowering the next generation of trusted messengers within our community too.
Yeah,
I know that is something
absolutely.
that is so important, especially the work that you're doing. I think having contributors that are already ingrained in the community already makes the difference because they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk. They know the folks. And yeah, I think in a world right now where we know disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation are so prevalent in the community. And Gary, for the Oklahoma Eagle, I mean, you've been in this community for more than 100 years. What are you all following in this, how mutual aid may be evolving in the future?
So I think that what's important for us in the Oklahoma Eagle community is, and we try to hit this note in almost every publication, is that while we are grounded in our history, the culture is fast moving forward, and we try to pinpoint ways in which these mutual support groups can continue to be there for each other, even in a changing culture. So I will pinpoint, for example, that the Black community in Tulsa used to be rooted in North Tulsa. It is not, it's still to some extent that way, but North Tulsa, I think, is about 57% Black, and the Black community is elsewhere around the city. So we try to pinpoint and cover ways in which people of color across the city are supporting each other. Another area I think that we are intent on covering is what role the church has in an evolving culture. How does it stay relevant to people who are younger, who fall outside of the mainstream of churchgoers, whether they are LGBTQ or come from other backgrounds? How does the church stay relevant in a kinship way to communities across the city? And as I mentioned before, a big part of our coverage is also about entrepreneurship. So we try to keep covering what does that look like in a modern culture where, for instance, you might open a business and the majority of your customers are probably not going to be Black as they were in the past. So how do we support that kind of entrepreneur community? There's a lot of other ways, but the point, I think, the main point is that we recognize that we're living in 2026. We're living in a very contemporary society. And so we have to acknowledge that many people don't think, vote, eat, even in our community in the way that they did in the past. So we try to embrace that and get other people in the community to embrace it. So.
Yeah, and I think it's also great that both outlets, yeah, you found different ways to cover this, and whether it's from the organizing, activism, or again knowing. I mean, to me, Tulsa is, yeah, that's Black Wall Street. So the fact that there's this entrepreneurship beat and the focus on new businesses, I know I want to shout out one of our other URL Media partners, Sahan Journal, based in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis. I think a lot of us remember the top of the year and all the just the ICE and immigration enforcement that was happening, but something that came out of that, some of the reporters told us about this mutual aid system that developed to help immigrant families get food, diapers, because they weren't leaving their homes. They could not leave their homes because of fear of deportation and arrest and detention. So it is really interesting to see how this evolution of mutual aid looks across our communities and also responding to breaking news at the time. Obviously we're covering this as reporters, but the community saw a need and responded to that. And so that is something to, I think we'll all be following for sure. I want to put out another call for questions in the chat. I think everyone's been listening, obviously, which I appreciate. But if anyone has anything they want to add, ask to our phenomenal panelists, I'm truly grateful. So many great minds and gems dropped in this conversation. But as we start to wrap up, quick fire for both of you. When we're thinking about a mutual aid, what is one story you really want to dive into? What is something that you're like, oh, we have yet to like really get into this, but something that you're really excited to dive into when it comes to mutual aid, or an example of mutual aid in your community that you saw recently? And I'll have either one. Gary, we'll start with you, and then I'll have T take us out.
So we are in Tulsa a community of readers, so and thinkers. So there are various book clubs across the community, and out of those book clubs come not just those book clubs, but discussions that are on a higher level. Where are we as a society going politically? And I think that those communities also are kinship communities, and they need our support. So I'm looking to move into that intellectual space and say, okay, how are we sharing what we have, what we know to move each other up in that space?
Yeah, I think for me here in Houston and also across the South, I'm looking at organizing the press in lockstep with the sort of natural way the community is already um, tight knitted or knitted together by the kinship structure. So I moved to Houston from Minneapolis in 2023. I've had a bit of an odyssey, Atlanta to Minneapolis to Houston. And I think arriving here in Houston, there is a very real authenticity to the way that the arts and culture workers here move in lockstep with the sort of literati community who also have, a direct hand in creating the stories and doing storytelling work, whether it be for the press proper or for, individual outlets or through the events that are had here in the city. And so since I moved to Houston, my life looks a lot like going to, art exhibitions and openings and going to, very dope like DJ events, monthly parties, while also going to movement organizing meetings around campaigns against, the mayor's arms to Israel at the port of Houston, or, organizing around things happening in the schools locally. So I'm looking for ways that Scalawag, given the fact that we are multi-local and regional and also run by community organizers, the way that we can sort of get folks in a room and do some real intentional movement building that can then inform storytelling. So the artist who's having an opening can be in the same room with the art writer who would like to cover it, and Scalawag can be a home for that. First here in Houston, but also in our other hub cities, which are Atlanta, New Orleans, Durham, and Memphis. So yeah, how can we not only be a platform for organizers, but how we can play a role in organizing the press in lockstep with community.
Yeah. And Kiana, I want to bring you in real quick as well. I think it's amazing how I've covered the Pew Research Center or used your data for many, many years, from my local news reporting to national news reporting. And I really appreciate the evolution of more research that is cultural. And, I mean, this was a study this was a Black study, and it was so beautiful to see in print. What is your team looking at moving forward? Are there any other research that we should keep our eyes out on that relates to the Black and Brown, experience in America?
Sure. Well, thank you for recognizing that. Certainly, Pew has invested over the last several years in building out our samples and our methodology so that we can adequately represent the experiences of people of color and people from different types of marginalized backgrounds. So thank you to that you've recognized some shifts in how we're doing and approaching our work. In terms of this particular study. It's the first of a couple of different studies where we're looking at Black people and their closest relationships. So this was the first where we looked at family, connection and care. And then our next study, which will be out this summer, we're going to look at Black relationships, particularly experiences related to Black singles and their dating outlook and the types of things that they think are important when they're looking for partners. So we're looking at that this summer. And then eventually later this year, we'll also look at how Black and men and women think about gender identity. What are the pressures related to being a Black man in America, being a Black woman in America? What is the most important thing you learned about being a Black man or a Black woman? So those are the things we're looking at this year, sort of Black people and their closest connections and their sense of self related to gender, family, and love.
I am here for all of that, though I fear if you had interviewed me for the loved one, I would have had, man, that's a whole TED talk, but I love that you're diving into it. And, to stay on a light note, because we got in some deep stuff. So I really appreciate everyone, getting into the weeds and really going deep on this topic. I want to give Scalawag and the Oklahoma Eagle a chance to shout out some of the things you're doing, because everyone on the call, if you're not associated with URL Media, we want you to dive into this work. We want you to read these outlets because, again, they're doing the work that you're not always seeing in the mainstream media. And we want you to use the Pew Research Center as a source of information and research and data because, again, every time I see a study from you all, I already know that the facts are there, the numbers are there. But Gary, start us off. What is Oklahoma Eagle doing? Is there anything you'd like to share with this audience that the publication is doing?
Well, one thing I would point out is that Tulsa has a black mayor, which is the first black mayor in Tulsa was elected at the same time that Donald Trump was elected. He's a Democrat, and he is forging a different path for Tulsa. So we feel as a leading voice for the black community to that we have to continue to report on in a very critical way the evolution of his leadership. Secondly, Tulsa is a city which is a very BIPOC. So we've got 20% Latin. We've got a very strong indigenous community here that's historic. And so we are looking for ways in which those kinship ties can also include BIPOC communities here. So keep looking to us for continuing coverage on both of those.
Yeah, I will use this moment to bump Scalawag's current spring fundraiser. So last week we launched our spring fundraising campaign called Uncensored or Censored. And it really speaks to the way that Scalawag choosing to be unflinching and have unwavering support in solidarity with communities in struggle, namely the Palestinian movement, has forced us to lose funding. We've legit had a funder say, "You said this about Palestine. Sorry, we can't get online with that." And we lost crucial grant funding. And so we, in a very mutual aid ethos way, reached out to our community, our network of supporters, our like our audience is at the center of this fundraiser. And so given the fact that Scalawag, publishes on labor struggle, we publish currently incarcerated people, we publish systems impacted people, we publish queer and trans folks, and folks, from the margins and the unthought of the margins across the South. It's really important that those who have and those who are available, contribute to a truly independent press. So that's the ethos that is happening behind our current fundraising campaign. And I encourage everybody who's tuned in, everybody who reads Scalawag, everybody, who just heard of Scalawag and think we're a great idea, like throw some coin our way, but consider becoming like a monthly supporter. But a one-time donation is also deeply appreciated. So I just wanted to bump the censored campaign.
And we actually put that in the chat so people can find it very easily because we do want to make sure, we talked about independent media. It takes all of us. That's mutual aid, as you said. That is mutual aid to keep us going. And Gary, I see your hand up. I'll let you have the last word before we close this out.
Yeah, so about a year ago, the Oklahoma Eagle transitioned from a for-profit to a nonprofit publication, which means that we are existing from donations, some from foundations, but also really from our readers. So we're forging a path as a Black-owned nonprofit paper, and we'd like to see some support for that. People who want to donate can reach out to me, and then I'll engage others in it. Gary.lee@theokeagle.org.
Perfect. No, thank you both. And thank you again, Kiana, with the Pew Research Center. I want to thank all of our panelists again for taking your time, talents, and just sharing all this information with us. So thank you all again. A round of applause in the chat, obviously, for this really good conversation. And on that note, this was an event put together by the URL Media team. And as I mentioned at the top of this program and conversation, we are a network of multicultural newsrooms that is trying to do this work, making sure that our voices are seen, heard, and represented in multiple ways across the South, Northeast, everywhere you can think of. We are in there and we're constantly growing. So we're very excited that everyone could join us today. We plan to do more of these, so keep watching us and make sure you follow URL Media on all the socials. As someone said yesterday, I was on one of our other cousins, Word Radio. If you put in the Google machine URL Media, you'll find us for sure. But thank you all again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.